Hey, this is Scott L. Miller on Sam IT. Today I'm going to talk about how we choose our RAID levels. Now we talk about RAID a lot, both on here, on SMB IT Journal, on online communities that I'm involved in, and I've become kind of a spokesperson for RAID. Because of this, a lot of people do exactly the thing that I try to preach against, which is they try to take this body of knowledge that I'm attempting to present and distill it into what do I do? And that's kind of why I have videos like there's no best in IT, there's no checkbox. If everything was just there's one thing you do, everyone would always do that and they'd never have to learn anything. And RAID is a great example of how that is not the case. It's never the case. RAID is never just a knee-jerk, this is what you always do, even though it's become insanely popular to do so. What's a bit crazy is I got involved in a lot of RAID discussions because in the 1990s there was this rule of thumb that said you always use a RAID 1 array for your operating system and you use a RAID 5 array for your data and you keep them separate and it's what you always do, and that was never actually what was said, but that was kind of a distilled rule of thumb based on a lot of knowledge, and then a lot of people ran with that over the years and just repeated it for decades. But they didn't repeat, here's why we did it, they repeated the answer, right? It's kind of like taking a multiple choice test where it's like A, do this, B, do this, C, do this, D, all the above. You find out the answer is C, and then running out with the answer is C, and forgetting that there's different questions being asked. But that's what people do. I don't understand. Since that time, I have been a huge proponent of, obviously, splitting arrays rarely makes sense, whereas in the 1990s it normally made sense, and using RAID 5, at least with Winchester disks, basically should never happen, and was officially deprecated in the industry, officially by as much as anything can be official, in 2009. That's a long time. Nearly a decade ago, RAID 5 died off. Now, if you're using SSDs, things have changed again, so the pendulum swings, right? But there was a time where it was completely insane to use it. Now it's really good to use it at the right times. But because of that, during a long time, I was pushing the importance of what we call OBR10, or one big RAID 10, which is consolidating your arrays and moving to RAID 10. I was not pushing that as the singular answer for all things. It was simply the default that should have replaced the split RAID 1, RAID 5 as what you do if you have no other idea what you should be doing. It's your starting point. It never was the old system the only thing you should do. Never was OBR10 the only thing you should do. Never has anything been the only thing you should do. They're always just, here's the most common answer, or here's the default that you should start from if you don't know any better, or here's the thing that if you want to beat it, if you want to do something else, you should beat this for your requirements. You need a starting point in a lot of cases, right? So you need something to work from. And the reason that we talk about OBR10 is that for something like, and I kind of make up this number, but it's based on a lot of observation and a lot of rounding, 65% of all deployments for singular servers today, and for the last few years, should be OBR10, one big RAID 10 array. That's everything on a single array. That says nothing about partitioning, nothing about volumes. We're only talking about the RAID. We're only talking about 65% of the time. That's just under 2/3 of all deployments. Following that, roughly 30% of all deployments, so that's just under half as many as we did with OBR10, should be OBR6. That's one big RAID 6. That may or may not have a hot spare, generally not, but it might, and that's not really part of that OBR6 percentage, just lump it in. And then that leaves 5%, and within that 5%, all other reasonable RAID levels should be used, right? So I don't know exactly what percentage each of these should be, but RAID 7, RAID 0, RAID 60, RAID 61, all of those fit into that last 5%. They all get used in the real world, none of them very often. And yes, RAID 0 might be the largest of those that gets used. Now we're talking on spinning Winchester disks here. Once you move to SSD, those numbers change completely, and it becomes something, and this is very rough, but something more like 65% RAID 5, 30% RAID 6, and 5% for everything else, including RAID 0 and RAID 10. RAID 10 almost never makes sense on SSDs because it's faster than most controllers can handle, and you just lose most of the benefits. And RAID 6 has become so safe on modern SSDs that the reasons that we would go to the increased safety of RAID 10 essentially don't exist, but the cost of it has gotten more dramatic, so just all the factors have changed. Knowing those big numbers, though, gives you a great starting point. We choose OBR10 for spinning disks because it is incredibly safe, incredibly fast, and one of our primary bottlenecks on most systems is our IOPS and throughput for our storage, and OBR10 tackles that in the best way. Sometimes we need to split arrays. That is really uncommon and generally only comes up when we are mixing different media types, such as some SSDs and some spinning Winchesters. Or we have really big SATA Winchesters or NL SAS mixed with a smaller number of really fast Winchesters like 15Ks. But these days, 15K drives are becoming increasingly unpopular as SSDs begin to beat them in price, so that is going away. And 10Ks are pretty close to NL SAS, so they're starting to merge as well. We tend to only have single arrays. Getting into mixed arrays generally means we're getting into really large systems. There are certainly exceptions to that, and I talk to people every week who are the exception to that. But I talk to more people every week that are not the exception, making it the rule. When you go to look at your RAID, you need to look at a number of factors. One is the amount of capacity that you need. The next is the performance that you need. The next is the reliability that you need. And lastly, and this goes for everything in IT without exception, the cost of it. This is 4 factors that are always having to be considered. That is one of the things that makes RAID a little bit confusing, is that there's so many factors to consider that it's sometimes hard to tune for the right ones or keep them balanced. Sometimes we're able to quickly realize that something like RAID 0 has so little safety that we rule it out of hand, and that can work pretty well because we simply don't want to include it. And that's the same reason that on Winchester disks we don't include RAID 5. It is possible to make RAID 5 safe enough, but then the cost becomes so high that it once again becomes impractical. So that's why it doesn't exist as an option on those types of disks anymore. But of course it does on SSDs. So when looking at your factors, you can't just skip evaluating your needs. But it is important to understand that you can start with, if you have spinning disks, which basically means you have low performance need and high capacity needs, that OBR10 is probably what you will use. If you're not going to use that, you are probably going to use OBR6. You can generally tell which you need because OBR10 is fast and insanely reliable. OBR6 is moderately fast and moderately reliable, but has greater capacity on larger arrays. If you're at 4 disks or fewer, you can't consider OBR6. It doesn't make any sense. OBR10 is the only thing you do on 4 disks. OBR1, which is kind of a subset of OBR10, is the only thing you use on 2 disks. 3 disks simply don't exist in today's storage world. If they do, you have a problem. In SSDs, you almost always use RAID 5. If you are incredibly averse to risk or your array is extremely large, you probably want to use OBR10. Anytime that you're falling outside of these 2 things, or your answer is not insanely obvious, such as it's a cache, it has no value whatsoever, and RAID 0 is perfectly fine, great. But other than that, you can pretty much stick to those 2 things. If you are needing to, for any reason, use something other than OBR10 or OBR6, or OBR1 on spinning disks, or you're going to do anything other than OBR 5, 6, or again 1 if you only need the capacity of 1 disk. On SSDs, if you fit into those, if you can see where you fit, you already know your answer pretty much. If you don't see where you fit, you probably need to grab a storage engineer. This is something that could be worked out in 20 minutes and have a really good answer, and a storage engineer will be able to tell you the risks of the different things that you're doing, things that you may overlook because this isn't something that you do all the time. But you're in a very niche category if you need to get to that point. Almost everyone, and this is by workload, not by person, but about 95% of workloads for SSD, and again 95% for Winchesters, will use one of these standard models that are so incredibly standard that you can pretty much just use the quick rule of thumb that I just gave you. Is it performance? Is it capacity? Is it risk aversion? Is it not risk aversion? And what is the cost value to your organization of mitigating risk versus performance or whatever? There aren't a lot of different things to mix in. If you're getting to enormous size and you're talking about many, scores of disks and massive hundreds of terabytes of capacity, reach out and get a storage engineer. There's no way that I could convey to you enough rules of thumb to make it able to be distilled. Now, if you dive into RAID, you could become that storage engineer yourself, but if it's a one-time thing, grab somebody. If it's not, then spend a lot of time learning all the different factors of RAID, all the different RAID levels, how they mix together, how you can apply them, and how they apply specifically to your controllers or to your implementations of software RAID, so that you can put all those factors together to make a good decision. But by and large, again, RAID 10 for nearly all Winchester deployments, RAID 6 for nearly all remaining Winchester deployments, RAID 1 where applicable, RAID 5 for nearly all SSD deployments, RAID 6 for really large or really risk-averse SSD deployments, and of course, if you only need the capacity of 1 drive, RAID 1 again. RAID 1 always trumps everything when you're talking about just giving redundancy to a single drive. It's kind of outside the scope of the discussion. We sort of assume that with Winchester drives, we're always talking about 4 or more drives. If you're not, it's RAID 1. And if you're talking about SSDs, it can be 3 or more drives, and again, RAID 5 or possibly RAID 6. And if you only have 2 drives, it's just RAID 1. It's that simple. There's no discussion to have. So that hopefully makes all of this pretty simple and clears up the fact that under no circumstances am I saying that there's any one thing anyone should be doing. At best, I'm saying that there are 4 things to do 95% of the time and a whole lot of things that can happen the other 5% of the time. And you have to do the research and you have to know what you're looking to do. And there are one of the reasons we start with RAID 10 is that it's safe. If you get it wrong, you don't get it very wrong. And then if you fail to RAID 6, you may get it more wrong, but you still don't get it really wrong. That's one of the things that is important with these rules of thumb, is that we try to make them so that if you make the wrong decision, you haven't done something disastrous. If we were to say, oh, use RAID 0 unless you come up with a reason not to, that could be dangerous because you may overlook the really important thing, which is safety. Maybe a lot of people think that RAID means it's safe and you don't need a backup, and they just assume RAID means it cannot fail, which is, of course, completely untrue. All RAID can fail, no matter how reliable it is. There's always a chance of failure. RAID 0, however, is so incredibly risky that you just assume you're going to lose everything, and soon. But if we started with that as the rule of thumb, a lot of people would just do that. If you have no idea what to do and you don't want to bring on a storage engineer, use RAID 10. It's the safest thing, and if you want to vary from that, yeah, lots of great reason to do that. Don't vary in crazy ways. That or RAID 6. If you're going to get outside of those things, certainly bring someone in, or same thing with SSDs. Thanks for joining me. Remember to like and subscribe. I'm sure I will have lots of comments down below. I look forward to those. And if you want to sponsor us here at SAM IT, you can do so on Patreon.